Good evening, good afternoon, and remember, Context is Everything Media Network founder and CEO John Michael is reading a textbook, cover to cover. Today, something. Yesterday, China, post-World War I. Today, Japan, Empire of the Rising Sun. For all 57 of you subscribers, thank you for your patronage. It is free. Please subscribe if you are not a subscriber. Thank you. Empire of the Rising Sun. Now, page 738 of 1007. We're getting there. Setting the scene. Solemn ceremonies marked the start of Emperor Hirohito's reign. Oh, that guy lived till pretty recently. A few honored participants gathered in a secret purple hall. Other high-ranking guests sat in outer chamber, able to hear but not see the emperor. Hirohito lived from 1901 to 1989. Interesting. In the hall, the new emperor sat on an ancient throne of Japan. Beside him, his wife, the empress Nagako. With great care, he performed purification rituals that were sacred, going back thousands of years, calling on spirits of his ancestors to pledge to preserve world peace and benefit the welfare of the human race. The Prime Minister then made his own brief speech, ending with the ringing cry, "May the Emperor live 10,000 years." This traditional wish was long and successful reign echoed across Japan. In fact, Hirohito's reign lasted from 1926 to 1989. An astonishing 63 years. During those decades, Japan experienced remarkable success and appalling tragedies. In this section, we will focus on 1920s and 1930s, when the pressures of extreme nationalism and economic upheaval set Japan on a militaristic expansionist path that would engulf all of Asia. Liberal changes in the 1920s. Liberal changes in the 1920s. New heading. During the 1920s, Japan moved towards greater democracy. Political parties grew stronger and elected members of the Diet, Japanese parliament, exerted their power. By 1925, all adult men had won the right to vote. Western ideas about women's rights had brought a few changes. Overall, however, Japanese women remained subordinate to men, and they would not win suffrage until 1947. Economic growth. During World War I, the Japanese economy enjoyed phenomenal growth. Its exports to Allied nations soared. Also, while Western powers battled in Europe, Japan expanded its influence throughout East Asia. Additionally, it sought further rights in China with the 21 demands that we read yesterday. By the 1920s, the powerful business leaders known as the Zaibatsu strongly influenced politics through donations to political parties. They pushed for policies to favor international trade and their own interests. At the same time, in the spirit of world peace, Japan signed an agreement with the United States and Britain to limit the size of its navy. The government also reduced military spending. Serious problems. Behind the seeming well-being, Japan faced some grave problems. The economy grew more slowly in the 1920s than in any time since Japan had modernized. Rural peasants enjoyed none of the prosperity of the city dwellers. In the cities, factory workers earning low wages were attracted to socialist ideas of Marx and Lenin. As these workers won the right to vote, many of them elected socialists to the Diet. In the cities, members of the younger generations were also in revolt against tradition. They adopted Western fads in fashion and rejected family authority in for the Western notion of individual freedom. During the 1920s, tension between the government and the military simmered, not far below the surface. Conservatives, especially military officers, blasted government corruption, including payoffs and powerful zaibatsu. They also condemned Western influence on undermining basic Japanese values and obedience and respect for authority. New heading: The Nationalist Reaction. In 1929, the Great Depression rippled across the Pacific, striking Japan with devastating force. Trade suffered as foreign buyers could no longer afford to purchase Japanese silks and other exports. Unemployment in the cities soared, while the countryside peasants were only a mouthful from starvation. A worsening crisis. The economic disaster fed the discontent of the leading military officials, extreme nationalists and ultranationalists. They condemned politicians for agreeing with Western demands to stop overseas expansion. Western industrial powers, they pointed out, had long ago grabbed huge empires. By comparison, Japan's empire was tiny. Japanese nationalists were further outraged by racial policies in the United States, Canada, and Australia that shut out Japanese immigrants. The Japanese took great pride in their industrial achievements and bitterly resented being treated as second-class citizens in other parts of the world. As the crisis worsened, nationalists demanded renewed expansion. An empire in Asia, they argued, would provide much-needed raw materials as well as an outlet for Japan's rapidly growing population. They set their sights on the Chinese province of Manchuria. This region was rich in natural resources, and Japanese businesses had already invested heavily there. The Manchurian Incident. In 1931, a group of Japanese army officers provoked an incident that would provide an excuse to seize Manchuria. They set explosives and blew up tracks on Japanese-owned railroad lines. They claimed that the Chinese had committed this act. In self-defense, the army attacked Chinese forces. Without consulting their own government, the Japanese military forces conquered Manchuria and set up a puppet state there that they called Manzhougao. It's the one with the gold. When League of Nations condemned Japanese aggression against China, Japan simply withdrew itself from the League. When politicians in Tokyo objected to the army's high-handed actions, public opinion sided with military. I guess that's a fallback and a failure of the League of Nations that they just said the Japanese, after they transgressed against the League of Nations, the Japanese just said okay and then left. Militarists in power. By the early 1930s, ultranationalists were winning popular support for foreign conquests and a tough stand against Western powers. Members of patriotic societies assassinated a number of politicians and business leaders who opposed expansion. Military leaders plotted to overthrow government and in 1936 briefly occupied the center of Tokyo. Traditional values revived. Civilian government survived, but in 1937 it had been forced to accept military domination. To please ultranationalists, it cracked down on socialists and ended most democratic freedoms. It revived ancient warrior values and built a cult around the emperor, who was believed to be a descendant from the sun goddess. To spread the nationalist message, the government focused on the schools. A government pamphlet, which became required reading in schools, criticized the Japanese adoption of Western ideals. With the influx of European and American culture into this country, individualism, liberalism, ultranationalism, and materialism began to assert themselves, with the result that traditional character of the country was much impaired, and the virtuous habits and customs bequeathed by our ancestors were affected unfavorably. The Way of Subjects, quoted by in Human Record, source of global history, Andrea. To practice the Way of Subjects, students were taught to absolute obedience to the emperor and service to the state. Renewed expansion. During the 1930s, Japan took advantage of China's civil war to increase its influence there. Japan expected to complete its conquest of China within a few years. But in 1939, while the two nations were locked in deadly combat, the World War broke out in Europe. World War II broke out in Europe. That conflict swiftly spread to Asia. By 1939, Japan had joined with two aggressive European powers, Germany and Italy, in the alliance known as the Axis powers. That alliance, combined with renewed Japanese conquests, would turn World War II into a brutal, wide-ranging conflict, waged not only across the continent of Europe, but across Asia and the islands of the Pacific as well. So that's the end of the chapter there. The next chapter is Crisis of Democracy in the West, 1919 to 1939. So I believe that this is one more chapter of context building between World War I and World War II. And join me for that. Thank you all 57 of you subscribers. I appreciate you for subscribing, and thank you anyone else who's still listening this far into the video. I appreciate you as well. Put this video on for your dog when you're away, and let the playlist just kind of run for hours. That'd be great. God bless. Goodbye.